Well, today is the last of a four-part sermon series that has focused on the gifts of this particular congregation. As I had mentioned the previous weeks, when I first came here in July and met with all of those cottage groups, hearing people's reflections on what they love about this church, these themes emerge, these gifts, these virtues. And so we focused on our gifts of hospitality and inclusivity. We focused on our gifts of excellence in worship and in music. We've once again heard a bit of that excellence just this morning. And last week we focused on our gifts of service, our heart for service, particularly in the ways we address food insecurity on campus through our Wesley Food Pantry and Alumni Fighting Hunger. And as we think about these particular gifts, they're not all unique just to this church. Many other churches share some of these same commitments and these gifts. They are all deeply biblical. All of the ways God has gifted this church are rooted in God's call for the people of God. And they've been given to us for the unique mission we have here on the edge of campus. And each of these gifts, people recognize, are shared collectively in our whole congregation. It's just a part of who we are. But I think they should also be expressed in each of our lives. And so I hope that I've been able to encourage you to embody these virtues in your own lives, to be welcoming and affirming yourself, to strive for excellence in all the ways God has gifted you, and to make a difference in all the ways that you can. So today we come to that final virtue, that final gift with which God has gifted us, and this too is deeply rooted in our scriptures. In fact, it's rooted in the wisdom tradition of the Bible, that we are a church that values both faith and learning. As one person put it at the very first cottage group we have, we don't ask you to check your brain at the door. That this is a church where we aren't afraid to wrestle with our questions and with our doubts. We're a church that isn't threatened by scientific knowledge. We don't avoid rigorous philosophical debate. We don't hide from historical facts. But as people of faith, neither do we silence our own voice that speaks of purpose and speaks of meaning, a voice that brings hope and healing into the world. This is a particularly meaningful gift for me personally, one of the reasons I was drawn to this congregation. In fact, Methodists have a proud heritage in education, going back to the very beginning. And you know, the educational values that are a part of the Methodist tradition of the Christian faith are often surprising, both to other Christians and to those who are outside of our faith tradition. Because Methodists have always had a commitment to open and honest inquiry and support academic freedom. Methodists have a focus on servant leadership, focusing on justice and compassion. And there's a commitment to the affirmation of human dignity. And being a part of Methodist presence here on campus at this secular public university means that it is our job as a congregation to represent these values among the great marketplace of all the ideas that are out there. And you know, the early Methodists, they were encouraged to become as learned as possible. Methodism in England in the 18th century, it was a revival movement. It was a religion of the heart where we wanted our hearts to catch fire for God and our lives to be conformed to God's will, to live holy and righteous lives. And yet one of the ways that the Wesleys saw that happen was through the development of the mind, to become as learned as possible. Both John and Charles Wesley and the Methodist movement itself started on a college campus at Oxford University. And it was Charles, the hymn writer of the two, who wrote in a hymn that we seek to unite the pair so long disjoined, knowledge and vital piety, learning and holiness combined. That what they understood and what I hope that we can understand today is that spiritual growth and intellectual rigor are not seen as contradictory, but in fact are mutually necessary. And that's the reason we sang the hymn at the beginning of our service. I know you had to flip back and forth a lot between the front and the back page, and you may have missed some of the message found in that beautiful song. It was written by Thomas Trojer, who passed away, unfortunately, last year in 2022. But this hymn he was commissioned to write in 1986. And he wrote it in honor for a man named Waldo Beach. He was retiring as professor of Christian ethics at Duke University. And he was commissioned to write this in honor of Dr. Beach. And so he took as his inspiration Duke's motto, Eruditio et Religio, which means education and religion, or faith and learning, as he translated it. And thankfully you have that insert with you, and you can look over those words again. It begins, praise, the source of faith and learning, that sparked and stoked the mind with a passion for discerning how the world has been designed. Let the sense of wonder flowing from the wonders we survey keep our faith forever growing and renew our need to pray. See, this hymn begins by naming the fact that our passion for learning, our passion and our drive for exploration, these things are gifts from God. That sense of wonder that drives us to learn and to explore, it's a gift from God as well. And recognizing these gifts, recognizing that they are gifts, that's one thing that helps keep us humble and keeps us active in our faith. It keeps our faith, in fact, growing. Because as we pursue, and we talked about this as we talked about excellence as a virtue, when we pursue the things we're passionate about with integrity and with all of our heart, it's one of the ways that we share our love of God. In fact, we just heard that from our scripture passage a few moments ago. Among the ways we are to love God is to love God with our minds. An English author and an evangelical Christian, Os Guinness, once wrote, "Loving God with our minds is not finally a question of orthodoxy," meaning believing all of the right things. He said, but loving God with our minds is ultimately a question of love. Offering up our minds to God and all of our thinking is a part of our praise. Anti-intellectualism is quite simply a sin. It reminds me of the motto of St. Anselm of Canterbury, who was the outstanding Christian philosopher and theologian in the 11th century. Fides, quaerens, and electum. Now that's twice I've used Latin in one sermon. That's all you get for the rest of the year. I'm done with Latin. I took Latin in high school and college, and it killed my GPA. So that's it. That's all you get. But his motto, faith, seeking, understanding. Anselm described the sort of faith that just believes what it ought to believe as dead. That orthodoxy that Os Guinness spoke of. He said, faith-seeking understanding means something like an active love of God, seeking deeper knowledge of God, seeking, recognizing we haven't yet arrived, that we don't know all things and all mysteries. It's active and it's growing. And this faith-seeking understanding, it gets to the heart of the wisdom tradition that we find in the Hebrew Scriptures, the wisdom literature in our Old Testament, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job. All of these books, they're so different in their perspectives. They don't agree with one another, but they all address the same set of questions at the heart of wisdom. Understanding what kind of world is it that we're living in? And what does it look like to live well in that world? And how do we live a good life? Discerning the answers to those questions, it requires learning to understand the kind of world we're living in, but it requires faith to understand how to live well in the midst of those realities. In fact, in the first 9 chapters of Proverbs, it talks about just wisdom in general. The rest of Proverbs are all those little pithy sayings that you could just pull out of context for whatever practical wisdom you're looking for. But that first 9 chapters, it focuses on wisdom itself, and it's described wisdom as an attribute of God. It says God used wisdom to create the world, and God has woven this wisdom into the very fabric of the universe. And so this wisdom, it pushes us beyond knowledge to consider what is good and what is just. And throughout those first 9 chapters, Proverbs is portrayed as a woman standing in the streets, calling out to those who pass by. As we heard from Proverbs 8, does not wisdom call? And understanding raise her voice on the heights beside the way, at the crossroads she takes her stand. Beside the gates in front of the town, at the entrance of the portal, she cries out, "To you, people, I call, and my cry is to all who live. O simple ones, learn prudence, acquire intelligence, you who lack it." Pretty on point. And one of the great gifts of Proverbs is this invitation to continue to grow in wisdom, to recognize the limits of our current knowledge, but also to possess that lifelong commitment to grow in our understanding. The more we know, the more we realize there is to learn. In fact, I'm reminded of the words of a philosopher, Eric Hoffer, who said, "In times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists." Well, our hymn today continues. In fact, those next two verses sort of speak into both the limits of our knowledge and the dangers of separating knowledge and faith, treating them in isolation. God of wisdom, we acknowledge that our science and our art and the breadth of human knowledge only partial truth in part. For beyond our calculation lies a depth we cannot sound, where the purpose of creation and the pulse of life are found. And so may our faith redeem the blunder of believing that our thought has displaced the grounds for wonder, which the ancient prophets taught. May our learning curb the error, which unthinking faith can breed, lest we justify some terror with an antiquated creed. In many ways, our commitment as people of faith to both the development and growth of our faith and to our own learning, it makes us outliers to insist on holding them together. The Christian faith itself has long battled an element of anti-intellectualism that has ebbed and flowed throughout the centuries. It's one of the frustrating things of growing up in Southern religion as I did. And regrettably, such unthinking faith has rooted itself in our current political crisis. We see it at school board meetings and in college boards. In fact, no less than St. Augustine of Hippo, this is 1,500 years ago, he battled those same impulses, had those same challenges we're facing today. He was writing about the ways Christians of his day read Genesis, those creation stories, and this is what he said. He said, to begin with, usually even non-Christians know something about the earth, the heavens, and the other elements of this world, about the motion and the orbit of the stars, and even their size and relative positions. They know about the predictability of eclipses of the sun and the moon, and the cycles of the years and the seasons, about the kinds of animals and shrubs and stones and so forth. And this knowledge he holds to as being certain from reason and experience. And then he gets to this point. Again, puts quite a fine point on it. Now it is disgraceful and dangerous, a disgraceful and dangerous thing for a non-Christian to hear a Christian, presumably giving the meaning of Holy Scripture, talking nonsense on these topics. And we should take all means to prevent such an embarrassing situation in which people show up vast ignorance in a Christian and laugh it to scorn. The shame is not so much that an ignorant individual is derided, but that people outside the household of faith think our sacred writers held such opinions, and to the great loss of those for whose salvation we toil. The writers of our Scripture are criticized and rejected as unlearned men. The more things change, the more they stay the same, and those words need to be heard in so many parts of our own Christian family. Is it any wonder that religious faith is dismissed by ever-growing numbers? Indifference, if not right, hostility to faith increases, and studies show us it increases as the level of education increases. And we see it particularly on university campuses. Back in 2009, the Reverend Dr. Sam Wells, who's now vicar of St. Martin's in the Fields in central London, which is the coolest name ever for a church. Not important for the sermon, if we could be like Wesley of the Grove or something, I wouldn't mind. Anyway, at the time he was serving as Dean of Chapel at Duke University, reflecting on that motto, faith and learning. And he noted a number of objections among his colleagues as he spoke to other faculty there. He says, one of the objections arises from a certain conception of reason, which suggests that for knowledge to be objective, it has to arise from dedicated, dispassionate research, free from every prior commitment, overshadowing prejudgment of ultimate truth. And so in this view, faith has a muddying influence on objectivity, a meddling influence on method, or more charitably, faith is an intuition one leaps to after the rational argument has run its course. And then he says people will run out a parade of examples from Galileo to Darwin and show how religion has sought to stifle the life of the mind. And he says others object not just because religion muddies and meddles, but because religion is just plain false. And in this view, he says religion makes truth claims that don't stand up to historical or scientific scrutiny, and it doesn't just not belong at a university, it doesn't belong in any educated society. And he said even the most charitable among them assert that knowledge and religion are different in their methods of logic. And since religion seems to be so emotive and so divisive, it's better for the university just to restrict itself to things that are open to rational and scientific verification. Better, it seems, to keep these warring siblings in separate bedrooms, not learning faith and learning, but faith over here and keep learning over here. Knowledge is public, says this argument, and religion is private. Just keep it simple. Now, of course, he says that these are vast kind of generalizations. They're full of stereotypes and misrepresentations, and yet people cling to these arguments. But he sees that tension, this tension between faith and learning, as healthy, as important. And he says it's because it now keeps religion honest. We of faith are forced by accusations of our meddling to demonstrate a Christian love of freedom and of truth. And we're forced by accusations of simply being false to remember that we must always be invested in the public truth, the claims of public truth. We can't retreat just into an insulated interior realm of private therapy. Our faith is meant to be lived in the real world, not hidden away. And religion is forced by its marginalization to the realm of the private, he says, to point out that left to itself, secular reason has compiled a record of totalitarianism, catastrophic wars, and a precipitous environmental crisis. In other words, he makes the argument that these things are what happens when the eternal union of knowledge and religion are broken. Faith unmoored from reason has done unspeakable evil in our world, but knowledge unmoored from purpose, from meaning, from the recognition of the value and the dignity of all people instilled in them by God, has wreaked equal harm, and all are impoverished. He says today it's for people of faith to show that knowledge and religion, they bring out the best in one another, and that the immersion in one only increases one's awe towards the other. And the final stanza of our hymn this morning captures that beautifully as Trojer writes, as two currents in a river fight each other's undertow, till converging they deliver one coherent steady flow, blend, O God, our faith and learning, till they carve a single course, till they join as one returning praise and thanks to you, their source. As Christians, we are called to learn and explore and to create and to never lose our sense of wonder. And our faith answers the questions to which all intellectual pursuits should lead, which is, to what end? Will our learning lead to greater justice? Will our learning lead to a deeper compassion? Will our learning lead to dignity and hope for all? Will it lead to peace and joy and hope and love? Will it lead to human flourishing? This hymn has a final verse. It's not found in our songbook. It's a doxology that he wrote in his original hymn. And I invite you to hear it as a closing prayer and meditation. Praise for minds to probe the heavens. Praise for strength to breathe the air. Praise for all that beauty leavens. Praise for silence, music, prayer. Praise for justice and compassion, and for strangers, neighbors, friends. Praise for hearts and lips to fashion. Praise for love that never ends.